Hey, everybody. Welcome to Facebook Live. It's Annette Hines here for Special Needs Companies, and I am so glad that you are joining us in our circle of care. So, tonight I am talking about one of my favorite of all time subjects, and it is a subject that I kid you not, I get questions about literally every week. I want to say every day, probably not every day, but pretty much every week. And it brings up a topic that I think is so important in our community. And that is all about our stories, our family stories, and why our stories are so important. Why is it important to talk about our history and to share, our struggles, our joys, our pain, and so forth. So, welcome to our circle. And I'm going to type in the chat because I would love to know who's here tonight. So, it is hard for me sometimes to see who is here and how many people that we have when I go live. I know that as we get close to the holidays and when we're in the holiday season, it can be a little challenging. We all have so much to do, and this is not the best time, depending on what time zone you're in, to join at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock Eastern. I'm not sure, depending on what time you're looking at the live stream tonight. But so the topic tonight is share your stories. Our stories are so important. Hey, Carrie, thanks for joining. Our stories are so important. They're important to share with each other because we definitely help with the burden of they help us carry our burden together by talking about what's going on in our lives. And over the last few weeks, whether you are a parent, caregiver, a sibling caregiver, another family member, or a non-family member caregiver, it's important to talk about your caregiving experience and to take care of yourself. If you are a disabled person, sharing your story is important in your own community, in your own circle, but we also have to share that story beyond ourselves. And I'm going to talk about that tonight. Okay. So, in sharing my story, um, the questions that I get, as I said, every week, whether it's through Facebook, through Twitter, through Instagram, directly when I see clients or when I'm out doing keynotes or when I am um, out just out and about in the community in every forum, LinkedIn, et cetera, wherever I'm meeting with people, inevitably over the last few years, two questions I get. How did you start your podcast and how can I start a podcast? And how did you write your book and get your book published? Because I want to write a book, or I have this book idea, or I have this podcast idea, or I'd really like to tell my story, or I know somebody that should really write a book or tell a story, et cetera, et cetera. And all of our stories are so important. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about both of those things for a few minutes. So here's the backstory a little bit about the podcast. And the backstory about the podcast and the book are somewhat on a similar track, but they, obviously they diverge a bit. So, a little bit about me. I have my own neuro challenges. You may not know this about me if you haven't met me before, or if you haven't heard some of my podcasting or some of the things. I do kind of just put it all out there. Um, but I am neuro different. I'm dyslexic. Um, I'm not uh, traditionally diagnosed ADD, but trust me, I have it. And if I were to go through the testing, and if I had traditional testing as a kid, I would probably test for it. Like many high achieving entrepreneurs, it is a factor for many high achieving entrepreneurs. So I definitely prefer to reach my audience by talking rather than writing. So podcasting for me is, or speaking is a natural outlet. It's, if you think about how most lawyers, or many lawyers, make a living, they make a living speaking in court, they make a living giving speeches, and so forth. And more importantly, when I started Special Needs Law Group, I guess over 9 years ago now, and Special Needs Companies at the beginning of this year, it was with this idea that all of my own family's life, I'd been searching for a one-stop shop for information and a suite of services for special needs families like my own. And many families can't afford or don't really necessarily need legal services. That's not what they're looking for all the time. They're just looking for information, or they don't necessarily need to access legal services from a law group in Massachusetts, right? So I wanted to find other ways to bring information to families like mine all over the country, and even maybe all over the world. So 2 decades ago, oh my God, I hate saying that. It makes me feel so old. Uh, but literally 2 decades ago, I started speaking engagements, and I started small, of course, to, oh my God, I remember speaking at the Natick Public Library when like 3 people showed up, and writing articles, although the writing wasn't the best thing that I did. And but things didn't really start up in a big way until after my daughter Elizabeth passed away, and Caroline was much older, because I just, was raising a family and didn't have the time or the commitment level for it. And I wrote my book, but the podcast launch was really the opportunity to combine my love of talking to people, which is so obvious, right? With my goal of making information accessible to families all over the world. It was just the perfect vehicle. So when I started listening to podcasts, I kept thinking, well, how do I do this? How do I do this? How do I do this? So starting the podcast was as simple as grabbing a microphone and a little recording device like this, and recording into a little, just a little, one of these little, I don't know if you can see this, little memory drives. And that's it. And then it gets uploaded into a into a podcast uh, company, site. There are several of them, and they range in price, where you can edit and you have different levels of control. So, that's kind of the long and the short of it. I've had so many interesting things happen to me as I started podcasting. And I'd love to, tell you that everything has been perfect and I've done the most amazing job as a podcaster. But if you've listened to my podcast, you probably know that that's not true. I mean, I swear, I have learned so much. Um, I have done it all. Like I've gone blank at the interview on people's credentials. I have really, like, I think in the beginning I actually like forgot my own name once. It was like um, I had gotten so nervous. Um, there's only doing your best, right? There's never perfect. And you just need to remember that what we say to our kids is really what we should be saying to ourselves all the time. In this world where everybody is posting the perfect pictures up on Facebook and Instagram and everything else, um, we as special needs parents, as special needs families, we know that life can be messy and imperfect and incomplete sometimes. And we need to accept that and accept each other and love it. And 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 you just have to love yourself through it. And that's the message of my podcast. And that's why I love my podcast so much. Um, so because the podcast itself not only gives information but tells a story, I wanted to really use it in two ways, right? It's I use the podcast to deliver information, but I'm using it also to tell other people's stories and other family stories. And so it's important to me to have a spotlight on other families and not just, oh, life is so hard, every special needs family struggles so much, and at the same time we're not going to do all the inspiration porn either. I don't know, do you guys know that 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 expression? Have you all heard that expression, inspiration porn? I hate it when everybody, it's like the symbol of like patting somebody on the head. Oh, aren't you the greatest little guy? If and he might be 35 years old. Oh, you were able to do XYZ thing. No, we don't do that here. We're not going to hold somebody up and be like, oh, that's so fantastic. This family is so wonderful. That mom is so amazing. No, I mean, we're going to cheer each other on. And when one of our colleagues or one of our parents has written a book or created a company or created a product, like when we had Say It with Symbols on, or when we had a I can't even think, there's been so many amazing things on, but when we had Jessica Leving on, and she has this great sibling book. Yes, we are going to highlight and shine a spotlight on her amazing creation, but we're not going to just hold up somebody just for the fact that they are a special needs caregiver and say, just for that fact, you're amazing. No, we're not going to do that. We get enough of that from the outside world, right? So, um, so that's the podcast, and that's um, one of the things that I wanted to share with you is some tips about if you are trying to get your own podcast started because telling stories is important. Here is what I want you to know about having a successful podcast. And I am very fortunate that my podcast has taken off. I could always use more listeners, so make sure that you share that with everybody. It's Parenting Impossible, the Special Needs Survival Podcast, and you can find it anywhere where podcasts are listened to. But there are really 5 tips to truly becoming a great podcaster. Promise you, if you follow these 5 tips, you will do well. Okay. First, you have to stay focused and on message. Okay. Don't go all over the place. Once you figure out what the theme of your podcast is, then stick to it. So let's say that you wanted to do a podcast about fishing. Don't do 3 episodes on fishing and then all of a sudden you decide that you're going to do an episode on cars. Okay. You stick to fishing. That's your podcast. And I do find that people will often decide that they're going to do a very vague podcast and they go shooting for whatever guests they can get who have a large following because they just want to get the followers to listen to their podcast. It's more important to understand what your message is, what your brand is, and then you'll understand what the audience is. Okay. So stay focused and stay on message. What are you trying to talk about? That's number 1. Number 2, have a teachable moment each week or each episode, however many, whatever episodes you have. Sometimes that's going to be 1 episode a week. That's generally what people try to do. Some people are ambitious, they do 2 a week. Some people do 1 a month. Whatever your episode length is, but there has to be a takeaway. So if your episode every week is highlighting somebody's story, that's great. If your episode every week is, some tidbit of information, that's great. Just make sure that your audience gets something every week. I have listened to some podcasts where the host just rambles. Trust me, you do not want to listen to those. Um, Hi, Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl. Cheryl and Cheryl. And hi, Mark. And hi, Irene. I'm just looking through. It's good to see you all. Thanks for joining. Okay, so the third thing, know and speak to a specific audience and market. So that gets back to my original point about the podcast and even, Facebook Live or whatever engagements that you are doing. When you set out to do any kind of a speaking engagement, you your audience, unless you're Oprah, you're not looking to speak to the entire world, right? So who is your audience? I said it very plainly when I set out to do this circle of care. Hi, Joan. I wanted to make sure that this was an inclusive group. There are parent groups out there. There are sibling groups out there. There are groups for people with disabilities out there. And there are groups for professionals out there. I want this group to be everybody in the disability community together because I think that together we have the best shot at coming up with an inclusive community and an inclusive set of solutions. And if we if we pose issues, if we have questions, if we need support, the more inclusive a group that we can come up with, the better shot we have at being able to support each other and to come up with the things that we need. I know that I did not say that as artfully as I would have liked to, and probably my friend Cheryl Chan would have said that better, but I truly wanted this to be the most inclusive group out there. That was my plan in starting this circle of care. So the last thing, I'm sorry, number 4 and number 5 are pretty closely matched. So number 4, do your homework on your guests. It's just, it makes me crazy when I listen to a podcast or even see something on TV and you can tell that the interviewer has no clue what is going on with the interviewee. Now, I will tell you that I have been interviewed so many times by people who have not read my book, barely even looked at my bio. They just, take questions from my PR company and they just roll with that. And what a difference the interview comes out when the person has actually really gotten interested in you and has looked into you and has really sort of dove into your stuff. It's it's so important to connect with your guest. It's so important. Your audience is going to be completely riveted when you are riveted by what your guest is saying. If you go back and listen to the podcast that I had with my friend Lisa, when I was talking to her about the stroke that she had when she was 21 and got diagnosed with moyamoya disease, I was crying on that episode with her. You think I ever heard of moyamoya disease before I interviewed her? Lisa Deck is one of the most inspirational survivors I have ever met. I get choked up just thinking about it. And she is out there every day for fighting for stroke survivors. I get goosebumps when I talk about her. She's an amazing woman, such a great person. Can't imagine not having done my homework on her, and you know to not honor her in that way when somebody gives you their time to come on your show or be part of something that you are doing, you show them that respect. Okay, the last thing, be prepared and send your guests questions and things to consider in advance. Okay, so it is important to do that. Now, your guests may not fill out your forms and they may not take the time to get back to you. That's okay. You're still going to do your homework and you're going to be prepared. And a good interviewer will lead the guest through everything. I've had that. I've had people who have not been a great interview. That's okay. I can lead people through anything. And so Cheryl is saying, oh, this is making her think that maybe next time she'll invite someone to interview who has disabilities. Yes. And she'll do the homework on whoever she invites. And Sangeeta's here. So nice to meet you. I hope that's the right way to say your name. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. So Cheryl, so that reminds me of one of my favorite stories about when I interviewed an autistic author, Kadar. So I don't know if you ever listened to that interview that I did with him. It was fascinating. He so he's nonverbal, and he let me see if I can explain this well. So he wrote several books, and um, it was a it was a an interview that I had to send the questions in advance, and I had to do the interview in a couple of parts because he had to use his mother as a scribe to help him answer the questions with a device. And he couldn't, it would have taken so long to do the interview in real time that we had to record the interview with pre-recorded answers in the right order. It was just fascinating. And we had some technical difficulties. And so some things needed to be cut and spliced and re-recorded, and oh my gosh, it was just the most fascinating interview ever. And I had never worked with anybody in that position before where we used a device like that to answer questions, and it was truly amazing. So again, I always want to be as inclusive in the podcast as possible. So please ask me any questions about the podcast that you would like to know. If you have any thoughts or ideas, or if you've ever wanted to start a podcast and there's anything that you want to know about that, go ahead and post them in the chat. I am going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the book. And believe it or not, people ask me so much about, how did you write your book? Why did you write your book? Talk to me about, sharing your story. So many questions about that. So the book came before the podcast, and my book started as a journal. And I know several people, actually more than a handful of people, whose books started as a private journal. I never thought in the beginning that this was going to be a book. It started out actually as some pretty angry, ugly things that I wrote after Elizabeth passed away. But as I started writing and I got to a critical point with it, I realized that this could really help somebody. It could really help somebody. And I thought about turning it into something, turning it into a book. And I don't know if it was Elizabeth inspiring me from somewhere beyond. I don't know if it was God. I don't know where the thought came from, because I honestly never thought about writing a book before. But there you go. The thought came to me, and it was just there. So there are really two ways to get a book published. The traditional way of having a book published and having your story published, a memoir published, is to work with your traditional publisher like HarperCollins, or, just one of your traditional mainstream publishers, and to get a traditional publishing deal. There's, pros and cons to that. The other way is to self-publish. And there are definitely some hybrids to that. Oh dear. Okay, that's funny. Facebook Live, right? Um, so there are some hybrids to self-publishing as well. And self-publishing can be wholly self-published, where you literally write your book, edit your book, and throw it up as a PDF somewhere. Thank you, Stephanie. Or you can do something in between. And so let's talk about each of those things. Thank you, Cheryl. So traditional publishing, it's extremely difficult unless you are a well-known person and you are writing a memoir. It is difficult to get a traditional publishing deal where they will actually pay you in advance to write your book, and then you you don't own your distribution rights to that book. They do. So that's a challenge, really. And a lot of people don't really love that. When you self-publish, you own your book. Uh, that's good and bad. It costs money to self-publish, and so many people will need to think long and hard about how to do that. So let's talk about the self-publishing route, because most of you, if you're going to think about writing a book, you're going to end up in that self-publishing route, and that's where I was. So I went through the hybrid route. I have a publisher, I have an editor, and I used a publisher that is somewhat selective, and they will only work with, you know, certain people who have a book that is, going to sell, and they're going to do, cover art, and it's going to be in a certain genre, and et cetera, right? So, you know, that's where the route that I wanted to go, and I wanted to pay an editor to make sure that my dyslexic self was not going to put a book out there with a lot of errors in it. But not everybody needs to do that, and not everybody wants to do that. I will say that I learned a lot about books and layouts and things like that. It's not that easy to do that on your own. So there's a lot of ways that you can do this by hiring out those services without having to spend a lot of money. You just need to be very careful about who you are buying those services from. Now, the other way that I find that people are doing things is they start out with a blog, and the blog turns into a book. And that is, something where they've got this material, it's already written, and it just needs to be formatted and sort of pulled together into a stream of things. And oh, Cheryl, that's awesome. So Cheryl is looking at doing something. Yeah. I'd love to talk to you about that, Cheryl. So um, I would say that, if you've already been blogging and you're thinking about stringing that through a theme, that can be a great way to go. And I have another friend in Colorado who has done that. I think that's a wonderful way to tell your story as well. So I would love to know, why do you all think that telling our stories is so important? Could you throw that up in the chat for me, why you think telling our stories is so important? I'll wait for you to do that. As I finish up on the book issue, please tell me why you think telling our stories is so important. As you are doing that, I want to relate this back to, um, so I'm going to finish up with the whole book piece. When you write a book, especially if you are not well known, you have to realize that you're not going to sell a million copies of your book, and your book is not going to make you money for most people. You've got to think about what the goal is of your book. Why are you writing the book? What's the rationale? What's the reason? I wrote my book for a couple of different reasons. One, I wanted to tell my family story to help other people who were suffering like me. I wanted people to know that there was an after when your child passes. I wanted to know that, well, when I read books about grief and loss, when I read books about, living in this world with children with special needs, a lot of them were so rosy and this and that. And I just, I, my life was different. I wanted to tell that raw story. I wanted to talk about the divorce and the bankruptcy and the, you know, the jobs that I lost and how I failed at everything and how bereft and how, just I felt like I was a terrible mother. And I really, I needed to, um, I needed to let other moms know, other parents know, but I also wanted the world to know, whoever cared to pick up this book, what our lives were like. I wanted other people to understand how to work with us, how to talk to us, how to be a friend to us, how to be a teacher to us, to our children, how to be a therapist to us, how to be a doctor to us, and so on and so on and so on. And if I could impact one other family, that's what I wanted this book to do. And the second part of that, the other side of that, is that Elizabeth's life would continue to have meaning. So that's my why for the book. And the podcast why is to obviously continue to get the information out there, to keep the connection in our circle, and to expand that connection, to keep things going and continue in expanding, make sure that we are all supported, and make that reach even wider than the book can do. The book is stagnant, but our circle of care on Facebook, the podcast, it's just ever widening, ever widening, ever widening. And that's why, I'm doing these things. And it is so wonderful. And I hope to continue to keep doing these things. And so as we tell our stories, I want to talk about what's going on at Fernald. For those of you who are not in our community here in Massachusetts, there is there's an institution that closed where many disabled adults and children with intellectual and developmental disabilities were warehoused, suffered tremendous abuse. Not everybody, but many died and were mass warehoused. And um, there's too much to go into here, but essentially what is going on right now is there's mass graves on the site. And there's a small memorial there like a on kind of like a marker for them. And there's going to so the institution closed finally, and the institution being closed, um, there's plans for what to do with this site. But the city is planning to do a light show, this garish, horrible light show for the holidays. And it's in very poor taste to do that at this awful place where people suffered for decades, maybe 100 years. I don't even remember how long it was open. And the fact of the matter is, the stories of the people that were there are lost. It's important to remember the stories of the people that are there, that were there. We have to tell those stories. We have to keep telling those stories. Nobody wants to hear it. They don't want to know what's happened. To tell the stories that nobody wants to hear is to make sure that they're not repeated. Okay? To tell our stories, the good and the bad, is to make sure that not just to support each other, but so that the outside world knows how we suffer, so that people can help and people can support and things can change. Okay, I'm going to read the comments because things need to change. Okay, so telling our stories connects people and makes them feel less isolated and alone. Yes. I think the biggest issue special families face is feelings of isolating and rawness. Yes. I think our stories let people know they are not as alone as they may think. Yes. Jinx, Cheryl, you owe me a Coke. I like that. When we connect, it is therapeutic for not just others, but for ourselves. It can be a powerful healing tool. Yes. To motivate new parents who have just been hit with their child's diagnosis. Yes. To share the learnings, knowledge we have gained over the years, to share what life as an autism parent is like, and to share that there's many positives to parenting a child with autism. Yes, definitely the good stuff too. A couple of reasons. One is so that we don't feel so alone. Many times I've felt like we are the only family going through what we are going through, but then we share and we realize we are not alone. I also think that it is important to tell our stories so that parents who are just starting their journey know that others have come before them and what we have experienced, and that you will have ups and downs. Yes. My son and his friends are such amazing young adults. Their stories need to be told. Yes. Hi. Hi, Linda. It's good to see you. Absolutely. We can never go back there again. We've come so far and we still have so far to go. Yes. Knowledge is powerful and other people need to hear our stories. Yes. Awareness and acceptance, or at least working toward both of these things. Yes. To celebrate all the good things and people that have come into our lives as a result of having a child with disabilities. Yes. I've enjoyed linking elbows with the Arc of Mass, Herb Cabral, and have a platform to have the stories told of the families I serve. Yes. Yes, stories. Stories are so important. I've been going on for about 45 minutes now and have definitely taken a lot of your time. And I so appreciate being able to tell my story to you today. I thank you so much for always being willing to listen to each other and for embracing my family. I don't know what I would have done these past 25 years without all of you. This community has been just the world to me. I I really have to say that, when my Elizabeth was born at 2 pounds, 29 weeks, my world was rocked, turned upside down. And I don't know what I would have done without all of the wonderful, amazing people that I have met along the way. It started uh, at about 12 months old when I first went to Perkins School for the Blind infant toddler program and met some amazing families there. And then shortly thereafter, I met some great families at Mass Families of Organizing for Change. And Susan Nadworny introduced me to a bunch of people. She is a force. For those of you who've never met her, whew, amazing. Um, let's see. Oh, so many people to name. I'm never going to be able to get through all of the people that have meant so much to me through the years. But the thing is, for those of you who have said this, I I am trying to give back because of all the people that have given to me, and um, this is the moment that I hope that I can inspire others to do the same. So anyway, um, if there's nothing else, I do want to tell you that next week, because it is Christmas week, there'll be no Facebook Live, but we are going to post some things, and I hope that you guys have a great week off. And the last week of the month, we are going to do a fantastic Facebook Live for anybody that's around to start your 2021 off right. How can we kick off and hit that reset button? Ooh, I'm so excited about it. I have a really great plan for our Facebook Live and some great tips for hitting that reset button in 2021. I hope you're excited because I am. So, and I hope you'll join me. I don't know if we're going to get a big crowd because I imagine that most of you will be really busy doing stuff that week or just kind of chilling and relaxing and having some downtime. But at any rate, thank you so much. I know this has been a long Facebook Live tonight, but I appreciate you hanging with me. It's been great. Thank you for letting me tell my story, and thank you so much for telling yours. Good night, everybody.